Hey everyone, I'm Gigi Rosenberg, a public speaking coach, and I am so excited to be here today with one of my favorite people, Seth Barrish. I met Seth years ago when I was desperately seeking help. I wanted to write and perform a solo show. So I sat down at my computer and Googled solo show class, and up popped the Barrow Group. Well, the only trouble was that even though I'm originally from New York, I live in Oregon and the class was in New York. But when I read Seth's bio and read about the class, I thought, I got to get into this class. So this was way pre-COVID. And I ended up being the only student who was on an iPad. Everyone else was meeting in person. So it was as though I was taking the class looking through a keyhole. But it was amazing. And what I watched Seth do as he transformed really all of our stories. I mean, some were good to begin with, some were boring to begin with, but he made them all so much better by his direction. So that's why I wanted to invite him on the show, because I know that many of you want to be better storytellers. Seth Barrish is an actor, director, writer, professional acting coach, and musician, and he regularly appears on film and television. So my husband knows now if I start screaming while I'm watching Billions, it's because Paul Giamatti has just walked into the prison and Seth is the evil doctor. He's also the author of this wonderful book called An Actor's Companion, Tools for the Working Actor. I've got mine marked up. There are so many things in this book that also make people just better public speakers that we're going to talk about today. And he's a director best known for his award-winning work with one of my favorite comedians and storytellers, Mike Birbiglia, and playwright Martin Moran. He's also the co-artistic director with Lee Brock of the Barrow Group, an award-winning theater company in my favorite city, New York City. So welcome, Seth.
Glad to be here.
We are going to talk about storytelling because I saw you do so many things with the students in our class to transform them. And as a public speaking coach, I work with people who want to tell better stories, etc. So the first question I have for you is, when someone is telling you a story, what are you thinking or what are you listening for to decide, is this a good story? How can I make this a better story? What's going on for you as you're listening?
First of all, I don't tend to think much about whether something is good or bad. I mean, obviously, after I listen to it, or I might get around to asking myself, is that good or bad? But I don't think much. My attention really is all on what are things that might make this a more effective experience for a listener or viewer. So it's really all that kind of stuff. And I'm paying attention to things that are kind of the same as anybody would pay attention to. You know, am I engaged as a listener or not? And if I'm not, then I start to go through a cycle of why. And based on the skill sets I've sort of amassed over the years, that will lead me to, certain kinds of things. I'm on the lookout for content related issues, how the story is constructed. And I'm also on the lookout for performative issues. Does it feel like I'm being spoken with spontaneously, or does it feel prepared? And the idea being that when it feels prepared, in my experience, it tends to be a little less engaging than when it feels like there's actually something spontaneous and interactive happening. So those are the kinds of things I'm looking for. On the content side, depending on how the story's structured, I will have different suggestions. That just all depends on what I'm noticing.
One thing I noticed you do with me and others that I thought was so helpful is, let's say I would tell you a story, and then you would say, well, let me tell you what I got from that story, or I'm going to mirror the story back to you. So you would not exactly retell it, but just say what you got from it. And often the reaction would be, that's not what the story's about. It was pouring rain that night. And you'd say, oh, well, you didn't mention it was pouring rain that night, because that will up the stakes a little bit. So that I thought was a really great exercise, is to tell a story and then say to somebody, what did you get from it? Or can you can you tell the story back to me?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of times storytellers, when they're looking for feedback, they'll ask things like, when left to their own devices, like, do you think that works? Do you like that? How does that play for you? And stuff like that. And to me, what you learn about as a storyteller when you do that is you learn about other people's tastes. You don't necessarily learn whether or not what you're putting out in the world is in line with what you intend to put out in the world. And that's the part that I think matters.
Right. So I remember you told us that when you're asking for feedback, there's only two questions that are important. And this is what I remember you said, but I'd love you to correct this one. The first one was, where were you the most engaged? Like, where were you like, oh, like what's going to happen next? And the second question was, where did you feel like, where did I lose you? Where was it confusing, or where were you just not getting it? Those are the questions I remember. Is that what you do? Is that what you usually say?
Well, with your permission, I'll amend that a little bit. First
Good.
of all,
Yes.
I don't know that there are only two questions to ask. That said, I do steer people towards a particular set of questions, and they're close to what you articulated, just a little different. I will ask sometimes what stood out to you as a particularly strong suit, or an image that stayed with you, or anything like that. That's one question I might ask. I also might ask, what's your takeaway? Having listened to the story, what in a nutshell, what are you getting? And then, indeed, I highly recommend folks ask, if they're looking for feedback that's constructive, were there any places where you got lost and or confused? And the idea behind this is quite simple. If they're lost, then there's a communication problem, right? If I send a message and the message isn't received, that's not effective communication. And so if they're lost, then I can then ask, I should say, where'd you get lost? And they'll tell me. And then I can know, okay, somewhere right around there was something that caused people to get lost. And I'll look to that part. Same thing if I'm asking, were there any places where you got confused? And they say yes, I'm able to say, do you remember anything you were confused by? And most frequently they will. They'll say, like, yeah, you said something about this and I didn't understand what that is. And that allows me, if I'm writing a story, then to refine that and make it crystal clear, or as clear as I possibly can. The idea is that clarity is your friend and confusion not so much. Sometimes I'll be working with a storyteller and I'll hear them say things like, I want the audience to be confused. And I'll hear that and I go, okay, well, you'll get it, and and in my experience, when people are confused, it's a recipe for them checking out, really. For them, they're trying to do mental math, trying to figure out some reference point. They can't, and then they just give up. And they may come back, but they're disengaged for a bit.
Another thing I remember from that class is when people were going to bring their stories, you encouraged them not to write them out, but just to bring like the bullet point notes. Because in the telling of it, when somebody told the story fresh, just from the bullet points kept them on track, things came out in the performance and the telling of it that they might not think about when they were sitting alone and writing it out. So I'll often tell clients, don't write the story, just bring the notes and tell it to me.
That's at least can be part of the writing process. That just as you said, if you're at home typing, it's a different experience, and whatever comes out is likely to be more considered. It tends to sound or feel a little more literary, which will feel less like somebody is just speaking, to you right in that moment. And so it can be incredibly useful to just write a bullet point of the story points you're hitting, and then just kind of, wing it. That said, I'm not adverse in any sense to people sitting down and writing things, word for word. It's just that developmentally it can be helpful to depart from that and see what comes up spontaneously. And then you have the ability to transcribe that. In other words, if you record it, you can now listen to the parts you particularly loved and then transcribe it and, type. And now it's written, but it's written in a way that is the way you talk, which can be nice.
That's great. So one thing I'll often advise people, I don't know why people do this, is a lot of people, especially when they're giving talks, they'll say, I'm going to tell you a story. And I find those words make me want to just run for the exit and get out of here. And I'm just thinking, even if Mike Birbiglia, an incredible storyteller, said, I'm going to tell you a story, I think I would have the same, like, get me out of here response.
Well, I can devil's advocate that a little bit. Mike actually sometimes will, at the beginning of an hour and a half evening, say, I'm going to tell you a story. Like, he will sometimes do that, and it's for a very specific reason. He's a stand-up comedian, and he sometimes wants to orient the audience to, like, we're not just hearing jokes. This is actually part of a long-form narrative. And so he sometimes will include that. And if you look at his specials online, some of them do begin that way. That said, I totally agree with you. It's not a regular practice. It's not something that I would recommend. It's, it's like if I'm going to tell you a joke, I'm going to tell you a joke. It's like, oh no, now the pressure's on. It's like, this better be funny because everybody thinks this is funny now. Uh-oh.
Yeah. Another thing I've noticed is, like, if my husband is telling me a story, and he's usually a pretty good storyteller, and then the narrative will end, and I'll look at him and I'll go, is that the end? And I think if anyone says, is that the end, it's a sure sign something's wrong with the end, or it's not the end, or whatever, because the end should feel like an end all on its own. And, if you need to ask, then something's up.
Yeah, I'll go with you hook, line, and sinker on that one.
Well, I want to talk now a little bit about some of the lessons in your book. And the first one is the conversation exercise. I just think this is such a fabulous exercise. So rather than me explaining it, and when I go to this book to use it, I'd love to hear you say why and how you came up with this exercise and what it is and when people can use it.
I most definitely did not come up with that exercise. That was something that was shared with me along the way. I'm not even sure exactly by who. It might have been through, I had an acting teacher, a guy named John Sticks, and my instinct is that he might have been the one who shared it with me, but of course he didn't. I doubt he invented it either. It's been going around a long time, but it's a very simple concept. The idea is that in real life we're talking. There's no doubt about it. It's real. And it comes with all the things that reality comes with. It's fluid. It's lively. It's spontaneously happening. It involves spontaneous thoughts, not planned thoughts, spontaneous behaviors, not planned behaviors. I can see in the little screen on our podcast thing here that I just said behaviors, and I jumped, I jetted my head forward, and when I saw it, I went, "Oh, that's a stupid thing to do." But it's certainly not something I thought of and planned in any case. Then all of a sudden, we get to scripted things where the words are selected and chosen, and all these kind of idiosyncratic behaviors, all these free thoughts, all these spontaneous things, all of a sudden go away. And it begs a question, which is why. And I don't know the answer, but I would venture to say we're doing something different than when we are just talking. And so the concept of the conversation exercise is if you can just give yourself the experience of talking, just really talking about anything. And while you're on a roll, while you're in the middle of talking, then switch over to the scripted thing. It puts you in a position where you can notice easily if anything's changed, if anything changes. And if you notice that thing, it's because you've identified it, it becomes easier for you to let go of it. So the idea is you're talking in real life, you start in with the scripted thing. If you notice anything change, you give yourself permission or even a sort of a prompt to like let go of that change, like, release it. don't do it, kind of a thing. And sometimes for people, this shows up in really obvious ways for a viewer. And sometimes it's very subtle, but in both cases, it can be profoundly important and helpful to making them arrive at, or helping them, I should say, arrive at real communication. Because when things are going well, in my experience, it does not feel scripted to the person saying it. Your brain knows, like, well, these are words that I didn't choose, but I don't feel like I'm saying a script. And so this conversation exercise can really help with that.
So that brings us to, I think this is the one that's hardest for me to do. And I don't know if you remember us working together. It's look to the response.
Yeah.
You would say to me, if somebody makes a noise, if somebody makes a laugh, whatever, look at them, because the audience will then feel like you're listening to them. And I think the more relaxed I get and the more into, down the road, like the more runs I have with the performance, I can do that more. But I know in the beginning, I'm like, I can't pay attention to you. I'm doing all this stuff up here, But tell us a little bit about look to the response, because I feel like that is such a great.
Well, it's just as you articulated it. And what I would say is that if you're finding it difficult to do, probably helpful to point out the actual doing of it is not hard. A kindergartner can do it. I can say, hey, if somebody laughs, look at them. And they go, okay. And then somebody laughs and they look at them. That's it. And if you feel, now you might look at them and it might, engender all sorts of stuff. It's like, okay, but your job when you're doing this particular thing is to look at them. And in fact, if you're getting a lot of responses from a lot of people when applying this technique, you look at all of them. So if 60 people laugh, I'm looking around, like literally looking, where did that laugh come from? And this is not just to make the audience feel like they're being listened to. They are being listened to. When you do that, you have to listen to see if people are responding. And when you look at them, you're responding. You're responding to something they did, and they feel like they're being responded to because they are being responded to, and it becomes genuinely, authentically interactive. So it becomes not a performer or storyteller talking at an audience, but a storyteller talking with an audience. It's not a monologue; it's a dialogue, right? And that's this particular technique. It's one of my favorite things to do. I find it in the way that you just articulate, oh, I can't do that. I'm working on all this stuff. For me, it's like, oh, this is great. It'll stop me from working on all this stuff. Because when I'm working on all this stuff, not good. That's what the audience sees. They go like, I'm seeing that person work on that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Another one of my faves was make it unimportant. Because I don't know if you remember, Seth, but I tend to be an over-emphasizer. And so you would give me the direction of just throw that line away, throw it away. And it was so freeing and fabulous. And it actually, it's funny. We'll describe it and then I'll tell you what happened to me. What's make it unimportant?
Well, okay. So, Marshall Mason was the artistic director of Circle Repertory Company, which was a theater off Broadway, as a very large theater, or I should say high-profile theater company when it existed. And when I first got to New York, that was sort of where I landed. And I was just in the environs of Circle Rep. I was down there, helping out on things and part of a laboratory and talking with actors and working with actors. And one of the actors I met said, Marshall Mason said, if everything is important, nothing's important. And I heard that and went, oh, that's a really cool idea. Because the idea is, as I understand it, is importance is relative. And indeed, if everything is important, then everything has the same level of importance, whatever that is. And so it becomes kind of a wash. And it doesn't stand out as like, well, that thing matters more than some other things. So here we are as writers, and we have a tendency maybe to fall in love with our own writing and imagery and ideas and things that we're very passionate about. And it's understandable that we would. And so we think it's all really important. But of course, if everything's important, nothing's important. And I don't want nothing to be important. I want some things to be important. So one of the things you can do to free up your performance or communication is identify a lot of things that are probably unimportant. It's not essential. This happens organically for most people when they tell a joke. If they guy goes into a bar and he has his dog and he says to the bartender, "Hey, I can make my dog talk." And the bartender says, "I've heard this one, woof, you're rough," or whatever. And he goes, no, it actually generally talks. And he says, "But if I do make him talk, will you give me free drinks?" And the guy says, "Yeah, sure, fine, whatever." And so the guy turns to his dog. He says, "Hey, Fred, say something to the bartender." And the dog looks up at the bartender and he says, "Hey, how's the wife and kids?" And the blah, blah. This is the beginning of a joke. I'm not going to tell the whole joke. But if you analyze what I just did, a lot of that stuff is, so nothing. It's like guy works in a bar with his dog, blah, 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 blah. A really, a less skilled, not that I'm so skilled, but a less skilled joke teller will, might go like, "There's this guy and he goes into this bar and he's got a dog with him. And he goes up to the bartender and says, 'Hey,' and that joke teller is making everything important. And all of a sudden, as you're going, you're as a viewer or listener, it's really hard to weed out what to listen to. I often think of the story, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. And when you are making things important, it's as if you're crying, listen to this, right? And then you become the boy who cried, listen, because you're telling an audience, listen to this, listen to this. And then the audience listens and listens. And then after a while, they're like, this is exhausting. I'm a little fatigued. And when that happens, they're out.
Well, just, as an overemphasizer, if I'm making everything important, it's exhausting for me too. And it's fun to say, just to throw some things away and even throw away things that are important things and then, have fun with it in that way, So I love that one. Well, the last one I want to talk about, and I think there's 99 in this book, so we're really only scratching the surface, is the rehearse in public. So this echoes some of the things we've already talked about. What are some of the advantages of rehearsing in a public place?
Well, in a public setting, there's all these things you're surrounded by real things that are not in your control, right? So that's one thing. You're going to be inspired and stimulated by things that are unexpected. Because, whereas if you're in a private room and everything is pretty controlled environment and all that stuff. That's one thing. The other thing is that if you're talking with someone, when you're in a room, it's very easy to fool yourself into like, I feel like I'm really talking, right? When you're in public, you'll know right away. It feels so weird in public. Like if I go to the local coffee shop, and I don't know that I'd go by myself and talk out loud. That would be a little creepy. But if I'm able to grab a friend and say, "Hey, can I practice telling my story to you?" And we go to the local coffee shop and do it. If I start going like, "So I went to this thing," like I will know immediately. People around me will be going like, "What's going on over there?" It just feels, completely off kilter. It's not. It's just so not right. And there's no hiding. And so that's another advantage of, doing that in a public setting, to kind of just key you in on when things feel real to you and when they don't.
Well, let's shift gears now. And I want to ask you kind of a nutty question. But often when I work with people, they say, I want to bring humor into it. I want to be funny. So when someone says that, Seth, I want to know, what do you say? How do you make something funny?
But first of all, I wish I knew the formulaic answer to how to make something funny.
Oh, darn. I wish you knew too.
I, as a storyteller, am not ever certain that something is funny. I might have an inkling, but the only reason I have an inkling is because it's funny to me. But really, an audience tells me what's funny. This happens so frequently. You know, a lot of times we've been talking about Mike Birbiglia, so I'll mention him again. But you know, Mike has been doing stand-up for so many years now. I mean, he and I have been working together for about 20 years. He was probably doing it 10 years before that. So he's been doing it for like 30 years. And he probably has a really keen sense of what's likely to be funny. That said, there's a lot of times where he'll tell me something and I'll start laughing so hard. I'll go like, oh my God, that is the funniest thing. And he's quick to point out, he goes, we'll see. Right. And what he's referring to is it's really the audience that will tell him. And sometimes the things that we think are the funniest things will tell an audience, and the audience is telling us, nope. And then there's some things that we think like, that's mildly humorous. And the audience is telling, that's the funniest thing ever. We're like, oh, look at that. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I think timing, you know, comic timing, which I think is something that most people have a sense of in real life naturally. You know, there's something they find particularly amusing, and their own timing kind of kicks in. Sometimes people think of it as like a fixed thing or something, or this external force or practice that, you know, you do this and it's funny. And in my experience, you know, those things don't tend to be so funny. And one of the most interesting pieces of advice that I ever heard was, this is terrible. I hate name dropping, but this is a story I often tell. I just heard a joke online. You know, Paul McCartney told me that name dropping is not a good idea. But I've never met Paul McCartney, for the record. But I did have one evening where I ended up, in a bizarre set of circumstances, having dinner with the actor John Cleese. And the reason I'm mentioning his name is because it's utterly relevant to this particular story. John Cleese is one of the Monty Python troupe, of course, and was the star and co-writer of Fawlty Towers, and had a long, long career as a actor and writer and other things, I'm sure. And of course, he's known primarily for comedy. And if for people who are of a certain age, who grew up watching Monty Python and stuff like this, it was pretty safe to say that most people would go, that guy is funny. And in this particular evening where I was having dinner with him, we had both seen a show. And he asked me what we both knew somebody in the show. And he asked me what I thought of the show. And I said, I didn't want to offend, you know, anybody. And my genuine feeling about it was like, well, it was cute. You know, it was like, it had merit. It wasn't this amazing thing, but it was all, you know, it wasn't terrible or anything like that. So I said something. In fact, I said, you know, it was kind of fun. It was kind of cute. And he said something effective like, I didn't care for it at all. And I said, oh, how come? And he said, it wasn't real. And I said, oh, and he goes, things are only funny if they're completely, completely real. And then in my head, I was like, wait a minute. This is the guy who does the Minister of Silly Walks and the Twits of the Year. And oh my gosh. And I was kind of going, and I thought, this is kind of cool. And then I thought about it, and I thought, it makes total sense. When you watch him doing the silly walks, he is really doing that silly walk. He's dead serious about it. And it's hysterical. And I think of it that way with regards to all sorts of comedy, that it's not a good approach in my experience to try to be funny at all. Find something that you think is funny and just share it.
you seem like a very cool, calm, and collected guy. But you've acted in movies and things that are, I'm sure, quite nerve-wracking. What do you do, and do you still feel nervous? And what are some tricks you use when, like, you're getting to do a scene with some, where the cameras are rolling and it's, you got to deliver? And what do you do in the moment?
Well, when yeah, sure, of course, there are times that I'm nervous, and one thing that I don't know, somebody shared with me along the way that has helped so much is it's a concept described as reframing, and the idea is that the fact that you're experiencing anxiety or nerves or whatever you want to call it doesn't mean inherently that your performance will suffer. It just means that you're experiencing nerves and anxiety. And where we get into trouble is if we identify it as a problem. If we go like, I'm nervous, and then that leads us to, oh no, yeah,
Right.
This is going to get in the way and everything. And so one thing you can do is reframe it. You change the experience is the nerves, but you just change what it means, not by being, making up stuff, but by doing the following. You can ask yourself, you can notice, I'm really nervous. And then you might ask, well, why might it be a good thing that I'm nervous? And the answers to that could be anything. It might be like, well, it means I'll be particularly alert. That might be good. It means that it matters. And it's probably good that this matters, as opposed to, I don't care about it at all. So it means that. It might make me vulnerable. And in my experience, vulnerability is really compelling and engaging. People are drawn to it. So there's that. It might throw me off of holding too tightly on what I'm thinking because I'm kind of freaking out, and it distracts me in a good way. And all of a sudden, these nerves that were a problem are now an asset. It gets to the point where it's like, well, one thing I'm very thankful for is that I'm really nervous and anxious about this.
I love that. That is so great.
And I do it all the time. In the case of acting, where you're with scripts and everything, it's like there's almost always a good reason in a fictitious situation that the character might be nervous about something.
Right.
Because it's a dramatic situation or whatever. And then again, you go like, hey, I am perfect. I don't have to pretend that one.
Yeah, that's great. Any storytellers besides Mike Birbiglia who we haven't mentioned today, who you just really recommend or really, really like?
Hannah Gadsby, I love her stuff. Phoebe, Phoebe Wallace-Bridgewater, is that her name? I don't know.
Yes.
It's fantastic. I'm working right now with an actress, comedian, storyteller, Rachel Bloom, and she's so good, so funny, and there's so many folks out there. It's storytelling has become a very popular form, and so wherever you live, I know you're in Oregon, is that right?
Oregon, Seth, not Oregon. Oregon.
Did I say Oregon?
There was something about it that just didn't sound quite right.
Oregon.
Oregon.
I grew up in California. It wasn't that far.
Oh, that's right.
Oregon.
That's right.
Oregon. That would be the Game of Thrones version. You and I have talked about this in the past, that because I know you, when you're working out stuff, that there are storytelling environments around where you are. And so it's omnipresent. It's just kind of everywhere. And some of the people that I listed, those are our iconic, well-known figures. But odds are pretty good if you go to a storytelling evening, somebody's going to have a story that's pretty darn good. And so you can get inspired everywhere.
Yeah. So tell us how we can get a copy of your book, how we can learn more about the Barrow Group. I know you're doing a capital campaign now, so can you throw out some websites and places where people can learn more about you and everything you do?
Absolutely. The first place to go would be barrowgroup.org. That's BARROW, the word group, GROUP.org. And that's the website for our theater company. This theater company was started in 1986. And we're dedicated to developing ways of working that make performances as spontaneous and real as possible, so that the storytelling is more effective. So that's a place to go. If you're looking just for, and you can get a link to the book right at that website. You can also, of course, just go to amazon.com and look it up there.
Great. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Seth. This has been Gigi Rosenberg talking to Seth Barrish from the Barrow Group. I'll talk to you soon, everyone. Bye-bye.